Chapter 1. The forest smelled of blood long before Mira saw the body. She froze between two pine trees, gripping her basket of herbs so tightly that the woven reeds dug into her palm. The scent was wrong. Not animal, not human. Something in between, with a metallic edge to it, as though the blood had been mixed with red-hot iron. Mira knew the forest better than she knew her own home. She knew where St. John's wort grew, where the vipers hid, where the stream overflowed every spring. But she had never encountered a scent like this before. Curiosity won out over fear, as it always did. She followed the smell, picking her way around fallen branches and ducking beneath low-hanging limbs. About 30 paces ahead, the grass had been flattened, as though something enormous had fallen from the sky and skidded across the ground, snapping bushes in its path. And then she saw him. A man lay face down, his face half buried in damp, rotting leaves. One sleeve had been torn to shreds, and an arrow shaft protruded from his shoulder. It had gone in deep. The arrowhead was probably lodged in the bone. A second arrow stuck out of his thigh. The blood beneath him had formed a black pool, already beginning to crust over. Mira dropped to her knees beside him without thinking. "Alive?" she whispered, though there was no one there to answer. She pressed her fingers to his neck, just beneath his jaw. There was a pulse, weak and erratic, but there. She rolled him onto his back, and he groaned without regaining consciousness. His face was unfamiliar. He didn't look like anyone from the village. His features were too refined for a peasant, yet he looked far too worn and exhausted to be a nobleman. Dark hair clung to his forehead, matted with sweat and blood. Beneath his closed eyelids, his eyes moved restlessly. Mira looked around. No one. No sign of a horse. No abandoned weapon. No second body. It was almost as if he had fallen straight out of the sky. Bandits, she decided. In her village, that was the explanation for almost everything. She got to work quickly, without wasting time thinking. Years of practice had taught her not to hesitate. She snapped off the arrow shaft near his shoulder, leaving enough behind to remove the arrowhead properly once she got him home, without tearing the wound open any further. The man groaned louder, his body jerking, but he didn't wake. She pressed a strip of cloth torn from her own underskirt against the wound, then tightly bound his thigh above the second arrow. "You're heavier than you look," she muttered, sliding her arms beneath his shoulders. Dragging him back to her cottage was agony. Twice she had to stop to catch her breath, propping him against a tree while she wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Once he groaned again. This time, something that almost sounded like a word escaped his lips. Indistinct but unmistakably irritated, as though someone had dared disturb him. Even unconscious, he's difficult, Mira thought, before dragging him onward. By the time her cottage came into view, the sun had begun to sink toward the horizon. She hauled the stranger across the threshold, laid him beside the hearth, and only then allowed herself to collapse onto the floor beside him, breathing hard. Then the work began all over again. She cut open his trouser leg and pulled the arrowhead from his thigh with a pair of tongs. The metal came free with a sickening wet sound, and the man screamed. The first clear sound he had made since she'd found him. His eyes flew open. They were pale, almost translucent, like ice beneath the morning sun. Then they rolled back as the pain overwhelmed him. "Hold on," Mira said, as though he could hear her. "It could be worse." The shoulder was more difficult. The arrowhead was buried deep and had struck something important. She wasn't sure exactly what, but the moment she began pulling it free, the bleeding worsened. Mira clenched her teeth and yanked it out in one swift motion, just as her mother had taught her. Better one sharp pain than prolonged suffering. The man howled and opened his eyes for the second time. This time, they stayed open. He stared directly at her, suddenly clear-eyed, as though he hadn't been on the verge of death only seconds before. His gaze moved over her face, her hands, the bloodied knife between her fingers. Something flickered in his expression, something Mira couldn't immediately name. Not fear, not gratitude, assessment, as though he were deciding how dangerous she was. "Who are you?" he rasped. His voice was raw, but there was something unmistakably commanding beneath it. The voice of a man accustomed to asking questions and receiving immediate answers. "The woman pulling arrows out of your body," Mira snapped. "Now lie still unless you want to bleed to death on my floor." The man tried to push himself up on one elbow. He immediately groaned and collapsed again, his face twisting with pain. "Where am I?" "My house, my village. The rest of the questions can wait." She pressed a clean cloth against the wound in his shoulder, making him hiss through his teeth. "What's your name?" A pause. Too long a pause for a man who had simply forgotten his own name from blood loss. "Rael," he finally said. "Rael." She repeated the name as though testing the sound of it. Strange. Certainly not a village name. "What happened to you, Rael?" Another pause. Mira looked up from his wound and caught his expression. For the briefest moment, something resembling panic crossed his face, quickly suppressed and hidden behind a mask of calm. "Bandits," he said. "On the road. There were 3 of them. I thought I could get away, but—" He winced, as though the wound had suddenly reminded him of its existence, though Mira was fairly certain pain wasn't the only reason he'd stopped talking. "3 bandits put 2 arrows in you and didn't take your coin purse?" She nodded toward his belt, where a purse still hung, heavy with coins. Not a fortune, perhaps, but certainly not something bandits would leave behind after robbing a man. Rael blinked. For 1 second, only one, he looked genuinely caught off guard. "They were frightened," he said quickly. "They heard something in the forest. Ran before they could take everything." Mira watched him for another moment without answering. Something about his story didn't fit, like a patch cut in the wrong shape for the hole it was meant to cover. But the man was white as linen, his lips had turned blue, and the hands gripping the edge of his shirt were trembling violently. The questions could wait until morning, assuming he lived until morning. "All right," she said, bending over the wound again. "Bandits it is." She tightened the bandage around his shoulder, careful not to put too much pressure on it, though her hands were already aching with exhaustion. Rael watched her movements through narrowed eyes. It was as though he were studying more than the pain, studying her, the steadiness of her hands, the way her eyes never left the wound, her complete lack of disgust at the sight of blood. "You're good at this," he said suddenly. "I have to be." Mira tied the final knot and sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm an herbalist, the only one for 3 villages. If I weren't good at this, half the people around here would already be in the graveyard." Rael made a sound that was almost a laugh, then immediately grimaced in pain. "Don't laugh," Mira said sharply. "You'll reopen the wounds." "As you command," he murmured. There was a trace of irony in those 3 words, as though obeying someone else was both unfamiliar and deeply inconvenient to him. Mira frowned but didn't ask. There were too many strange things about this man. His unusual name, his wounds, the way he looked at her. The peculiar way he spoke, as though every ordinary word required conscious effort, as though he had to choose each one carefully instead of simply speaking naturally. She stood, wiped her hands on the edge of the table, and walked over to the hearth to add more wood. The flames rose higher, casting dancing orange light across the stranger's pale face. "Sleep," she said without turning around. We'll decide what to do with you in the morning." There was no answer. Mira turned and saw that his eyes were closed. Whether he was sleeping or had simply passed out from blood loss, she couldn't tell. His chest rose and fell slowly but steadily. She stood there, watching him for a long time, before finally blowing out the candle. Something about the man unsettled her. It didn't frighten her exactly, but it made her keep her knife within reach when she lay down to sleep. Mira couldn't have said exactly what bothered her. Maybe it was his eyes. Maybe it was the way he'd said bandits, too smoothly, too quickly, like a line he'd rehearsed. Or perhaps it was simply the instinct of an herbalist who had spent 20 years learning to read people's bodies better than their words. She lay down on the straw mattress in the corner, away from the hearth, and listened to his breathing in the darkness for a long time before sleep finally claimed her. By morning, Rael was still alive. More than that, he was conscious, though so weak he couldn't lift an arm without trembling. Mira entered the cottage carrying an armful of firewood and found him sitting up, or rather, trying to sit up, supporting himself on his uninjured arm, his face twisted with effort. "Lie down," she ordered, dropping the wood beside the hearth. "Who told you you could move?" "I don't require permission," Rael said through clenched teeth. Still, he lowered himself back down, breathing heavily. Mira raised an eyebrow. "In my house you do. Otherwise, you're welcome to go look for help in the forest where I found you." He shot her a sharp, irritated look, the look of a man unaccustomed to being contradicted. Then, as though remembering something, his expression softened. "Forgive me," he said. The words sounded awkward, almost unfamiliar in his mouth. "You saved my life. That was rude of me." Mira froze for a moment, surprised by the sudden change. Then she shrugged, hiding her reaction behind her usual practicality. "I'll survive your rudeness, but if you tear those wounds open, you won't survive anything. You'll bleed to death on my floor, and I'll have to explain to the neighbors where the corpse came from." Rael made a quiet sound, not quite laughter, but close. "Practical," he observed. "Survival tends to be practical," Mira replied, kneeling beside him to inspect the bandages. There was no fresh blood, which was a good sign, but the skin around the wound in his shoulder remained inflamed and hot to the touch. "You're lucky the arrows didn't hit anything vital. Another couple of inches, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." She changed the bandage, careful not to disturb the wound more than necessary. Rael watched her hands with the same narrowed gaze as before, but there was something different in his expression now. He wasn't assessing her anymore. He seemed thoughtful, as though he were weighing something inside himself, slowly coming to a decision. "How long will I have to stay here?" he finally asked. "Until you can make it a mile from my doorstep without dropping dead." Mira tightened the final knot and sat back on her heels. "Judging by that shoulder, 2 weeks at least, maybe 3. Rael grimaced, as though this news were worse than the wound itself. "I don't have 3 weeks," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You have a body that disagrees." Mira's tone was firm. "You're welcome to argue with it. I'm staying out of those negotiations." He looked at her for a long moment, studying her as though he saw something in her that she herself had never noticed. Mira held his gaze without looking away, even though something in her chest tightened with an unfamiliar warmth. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "You know mine. It's only fair that I know yours." "Mira." "Mira," he repeated. There was something strangely gentle in the way he said her name, as though he were carefully weighing every sound. "Thank you, Mira, for not walking away." She gave a small scoff as she rose to her feet, hiding her embarrassment behind brisk practicality. "Nothing to thank me for. Anyone would have done the same." But as she stepped outside to fetch fresh water, she caught herself thinking that she didn't entirely believe that. And somehow, even beyond the threshold of her cottage, the memory of Rael's pale, almost translucent eyes stayed with her, clinging to her skin like the scent of that strange, unnatural blood in the forest. Chapter 2. By the end of the third day, Rael had come to hate his own helplessness. He lay on the narrow cot, staring at the smoke-darkened ceiling and listening to Mira clatter pots by the hearth. His shoulder burned with a dull ache whenever he moved, and sharp stabs of pain shot through his thigh every time he bent his leg even slightly. His body had obeyed him without question all his life, in battle, in flight, in anything he had ever demanded of it. Now, it betrayed him at every turn. "Stop moving around," Mira said without looking back. "If you tear the stitches, you'll be stuck here even longer." "I'm not moving around," Rael said through clenched teeth. "I've been lying perfectly still for 2 hours." "You're breathing like you're preparing for battle." She set a bowl of broth in front of him. It smelled of herbs he didn't recognize. "Eat. You need strength, not irritation." Rael looked at the bowl, then at her. In another life, the one that existed beyond the walls of this cottage, no one would have dared speak to him in such a tone. Servants bowed. Courtiers chose their words carefully. Even his father had always spoken to him as the future ruler, never as though he were some disobedient boy. Here, an herbalist scolded him like a troublesome apprentice. He picked up the bowl with his uninjured hand and couldn't suppress a grimace when the awkward movement sent pain through his shoulder. "Careful," Mira said, and despite the sharpness of the word, there was something almost caring in her voice. Rael caught himself watching her longer than he should have. She stood beside the table with her sleeves rolled up, her hands calloused from years of working with herbs, her hair gathered into a careless knot with several loose strands falling around her face. She was nothing like the ladies of the court, wrapped in silk and adorned with carefully practiced smiles. And yet, there was something about her that made it difficult for him to look away. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly. "Doing what?" "Taking care of me. A stranger you found in the forest with 2 arrows in him. You could have left me exactly where you found me." Mira turned toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression was strange, not offended, but thoughtful, as though the question had caught her off guard. "I'm an herbalist," she finally said. "People come to me when they're sick or injured. I don't ask whether they deserve help. I just help them." "Even strangers you know nothing about?" "Especially strangers." She shrugged. "I already know what sort of trouble my neighbors get themselves into. You're a mystery. Mysteries are more interesting." Rael gave a short laugh, then immediately winced as pain pulled at his side. "So I'm a mystery to you?" "To me, you're a patient who talks too much instead of eating," Mira shot back, though the faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of her mouth. He raised the spoon and nearly dropped it when a sharp pain tore through his shoulder. Broth spilled across the blanket. "Give me that," Mira sighed, taking the bowl from his hand. "Since apparently you can't even manage a spoon." "I can manage," Rael said through clenched teeth, feeling heat rise to his face, not from pain, but humiliation. "Of course you can." She sat on the edge of the cot, scooped up some broth, and held the spoon to his lips with the calm expression of someone feeding a stubborn child. "Eat before it gets cold." Rael went still. He looked at the spoon, then at her. 2 feelings warred inside him. Pride screamed that the crown prince could not allow himself to be fed like a helpless old man. But there was something else as well. Quieter, warmer. Something that made him sit still and allow this sharp-tongued, stubborn woman to care for him. He opened his mouth and let her feed him. The broth was surprisingly good. The herbs gave it a slightly bitter freshness, nothing like the bland palace soups prepared for the sick. Rael swallowed without taking his eyes off Mira's face. The concentration in her expression, the small crease between her brows. "It's good," he said quietly. Mira glanced up at him as though she hadn't expected the compliment. It's just broth. Not just broth. He meant it, and for some reason, it mattered to him that she knew that. Thank you. Something flickered across her face, quick and barely noticeable, before she hid it again behind her usual businesslike frown. Eat quietly, she ordered. I don't like being thanked for things I'm supposed to do anyway. But when she lifted the next spoonful to his lips, her hands were gentler than before. Rael felt strong enough to try standing. It was a mistake. The moment he lowered his feet to the floor and tried to rise, the room tilted violently around him, and his injured leg gave way. He would have fallen if he hadn't grabbed the edge of the table. In doing so, he knocked over a clay cup, which shattered loudly against the floor. What are you doing? Mira rushed into the room at the sound, her eyes widening when she saw him gripping the table with white-knuckled fingers. Sit down, now! I'm fine, Rael rasped, though the room was still spinning around him. You're about as fine as that cup, she snapped. She slipped an arm beneath his uninjured side and, with surprising strength for someone her size, forced him back onto the cot. You had 2 arrows pulled out of you 3 days ago, and you decided now was a good time to take a stroll around the house? I needed to see if I could walk. And? Can you? Rael said nothing. That was answer enough. Mira sighed and crouched to gather the broken pieces of the cup. Rael watched her from above, the practiced way her fingers picked up the sharp shards without cutting herself, the slight frown of concentration on her face as she dealt with such an ordinary task. I'm sorry, he said again, twice in 3 days, more times than he'd spoken those words in the entire previous year. For the cup, and for not listening to you. Mira looked up at him, still crouched among the shards. Are you actually used to listening to anyone? She asked. There was more curiosity than accusation in her voice. Rael opened his mouth, ready with a sharp reply, but stopped himself. The truth was inconvenient. No, he wasn't used to listening. All his life, people had listened to him. Not particularly, he admitted instead. I can tell. Mira stood, gathering the shards in her apron. All right. Since you're so desperate to be useful instead of sitting still, I'll give you something you can actually do. She nodded toward a basket of dried herbs beside the hearth. Sort those. Separate the St. John's wort from the chamomile. They look similar when they're dried, but you can tell them apart by smell. Think you can manage that without breaking anything? Rael stared at the basket of dried stems as though she'd asked him to sort an enemy army by the color of their cloaks. I don't know anything about herbs. Then you'll learn. Mira pushed the basket closer to his cot. Not everything in the world revolves around what you already know how to do. Rael was about to argue, but something in her tone stopped him. There was no mockery in it, only calm certainty. He picked up a bundle of dried herbs with his good hand and studied it, trying to detect the difference she'd described. An hour later, when Mira returned to check his progress, she found 2 neat piles, almost perfectly sorted, except for a few misplaced stems. Not bad, she admitted, raising an eyebrow, for someone who couldn't hold a spoon 3 days ago. Rael felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth at the sparse praise, one that had nothing to do with the heat of the nearby hearth. I had a good teacher, he said. Mira snorted as she picked up the basket, but before she turned back toward the hearth, Rael saw the corners of her mouth twitch. Almost a smile. That night, when the cottage had fallen into darkness and silence, broken only by the faint crackling of dying embers, Rael lay awake, staring toward the corner where Mira slept on her straw mattress. 3 days ago, he had been prepared to die in the forest, bleeding out, betrayed by his own uncle, his father dead, his throne, his future, everything taken from him at once. 3 days ago, His only thought had been to survive long enough to find proof of his uncle's betrayal and reclaim what was rightfully his. He hadn't expected anyone to stop for him. He hadn't expected a sharp-tongued, stubborn woman with calloused hands and a kind heart hidden behind a permanent frown. And he certainly hadn't expected gratitude, a feeling he had previously experienced mostly as a matter of courtesy, to suddenly become something so heavy, so real. Something that lodged in his chest whenever he looked at the sleeping figure in the corner. Rael closed his eyes and ordered himself not to think about it. He had a purpose: find proof of his uncle's treason, reclaim the throne, avenge his father. The woman who had saved his life was never supposed to become part of that plan. But as sleep finally began to take him, he could still hear Mira's slow, steady breathing in the darkness. And somehow, for the first time in 3 days, it made him feel safe. Chapter 3. A week passed faster than Rael had expected. His shoulder was healing, more slowly than it should have, but healing nonetheless. Mira changed the bandages every day, frowning over the wound and muttering that it was behaving strangely, though she never explained exactly what she meant. Rael tried not to meet her eyes whenever she did. He knew why the wound was healing slowly. His dragon blood was fighting the poison that suppressed its power, slowly but steadily winning. An ordinary human would either have died from a wound like this within a day or spent months recovering from it. Rael would recover in weeks. Sooner or later, Mira was bound to notice the difference. For now, however, she was too busy running the household to ask too many questions. "Hold it properly," she ordered, handing him a knife and an armful of carrots. "If you manage to ruin these too, I'm going to start wondering whether saving you was a mistake." Rael took the knife with an expression of mock offense. "I know how to handle a weapon." "That is not a weapon. It's a vegetable." Mira sat across from him at the table and began peeling potatoes with the practiced ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. "Let's see if you can tell the difference." Rael gave a quiet huff and started chopping the carrots. The pieces were uneven and far too large, but he worked with determined concentration. His shoulder pulled painfully with every movement, but he endured it, unwilling to look helpless in front of her again. In the days he'd spent in this cottage, he'd learned more practical skills than he had in his entire life at the palace. How to light a hearth without burning down the house. How to tell St. John's wort from chamomile. How not to burn himself while taking a pot off the fire with his bare hands, a lesson he'd learned the hard way, much to Mira's amusement. "You've never cooked before, have you?" she asked without looking up from the potatoes. "I never had to," Rael answered evasively. "Let me guess." She gave him a quick glance, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Wealthy family? Everything was done for you?" Rael froze for a fraction of a second before continuing to cut the carrot. "Something like that," he said. "It's behind me now." "What happened?" The question hung between them, simple, natural, and yet Rael felt everything inside him tighten. He couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't tell her that his family, his home, his future had all been stolen by the man he had trusted more than anyone in the world. "It's a long story," he said instead, "and not a pleasant one." Mira studied him for a long moment, as though deciding whether to press him. Then she nodded and returned to peeling the potatoes. "All right, not everyone has to tell everyone everything." She paused. "But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm as good at listening as I am at treating wounds." Something shifted in Rael's chest at those simple words, at how easily she backed away without demanding more than he was willing to give. No one had ever offered him anything like that before. At the palace, everyone wanted something: loyalty, influence, a position at court. Here, in this tiny cottage at the edge of the forest, a woman with calloused hands simply offered to listen to him without asking for anything in return. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mira merely huffed, hiding her embarrassment behind her usual brisk manner. "Don't thank me. Cut those carrots more evenly, or the soup is going to be full of surprises." The oddities began to pile up, just as Rael had feared. One morning, while they were carrying water for the washing, Mira stopped in the doorway and stared at his hands. They were submerged in ice-cold well water, and he showed not the slightest sign of discomfort. "Aren't you cold?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Rael belatedly pulled his hands out and pretended to shiver. "Cold," he lied. "It's tolerable." Mira said nothing, but her gaze lingered on him a little too long, and Rael knew she hadn't believed him. Another time, while changing the bandage on his shoulder, she stopped and stared at the scar. It should still have been fresh and inflamed. Instead, pale, smooth skin was already forming over it, far too quickly for a wound only 10 days old. "Wounds don't heal like this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Maybe I'm just unusually healthy," Rael said, trying to make a joke of it. Mira looked up at him. Her gaze was direct and searching, and something in her eyes told him his excuses were no longer working. "Maybe," she said slowly. "Or maybe you're not quite who you're pretending to be." Rael went still. His heart skipped a beat. But instead of pressing him, Mira merely shook her head and returned to the bandage, as though setting the question aside for later. "It doesn't matter," she said. "As long as you don't bring trouble into my home, whatever you're hiding is none of my business." Her voice was calm, but Rael could hear the unspoken question beneath the words, stretched taut between them like a drawn bowstring. She suspected something. Maybe she didn't know the truth yet, but she knew something didn't add up. Strangely, that thought didn't frighten him as much as it should have. Something else did. He didn't want her to learn the truth from someone else. He wanted to tell her himself when the time came, if it ever did. It happened near the end of the second week, toward evening, when the sky beyond the windows had turned a deep shade of orange. Mira was crouched in front of the hearth, arranging the firewood, when one of the embers cracked and sent a spark flying directly onto her hand. She cried out and jerked her hand away. Rael, who had been sitting nearby, was at her side faster than his injured leg should have allowed. "Let me see," he said, taking hold of her wrist. "It's nothing, just a small burn," Mira said, trying to wave him off. But Rael was already holding her hand between his, examining the reddened skin at the base of her fingers. "It's not nothing. We need to put something cold on it." He reached toward the clay pitcher of water standing against the wall, and without thinking, closed his hand around her burned palm. Mira gasped in surprise, not from pain, from the cold of his skin. His hand felt as though he'd just stepped inside from a winter storm, rather than spent the entire evening beside a blazing hearth. They both froze. Mira looked up at him, and in her eyes, Rael saw what he'd been dreading most. Understanding. Not complete, not certain, but enough for the question, "Who are you?" to hang silently between them without either of them speaking it aloud. "Your hands," she whispered. "Are they always this cold?" Rael didn't answer. He couldn't. The words caught somewhere in his chest, displaced by the sudden awareness of how close her face was to his, by the warmth of her breath against his chin, by the fact that her fingers, still enclosed in his hand, made no attempt to pull away. "Mira," he began, though he had no idea what he intended to say next. She looked up at him. Her dark eyes reflected the orange glow of the hearth, and something in that gaze made him forget every word he might have spoken. Rael never knew which of them moved first. He only knew that, in the next moment, his lips touched hers. Carefully, tentatively, as though they both feared it was wrong, yet neither of them pulled away. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, brief and gentle, almost as though it had happened by accident rather than intention. But Rael felt that simple touch reverberate through his chest more powerfully than any wound he'd suffered in the forest. Mira was the first to pull away. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She began, then stopped, unable to find the words. I'm sorry, Rael said quickly, caught between the urge to retreat and the equally powerful desire to pull her back to him. I shouldn't have. No, she interrupted, rising too quickly, almost as though she were fleeing. It's nothing. We'll forget it happened. She turned toward the hearth, hiding her face from him. But Rael had already seen the way her fingers trembled as she adjusted the logs. It wasn't from the cold. Mira, we'll forget it, she repeated more firmly, without turning around. Your wound is healing. I have work to do. We don't have time for things like this. Rael stared at her rigid back, still feeling the lingering warmth of that brief touch in his chest. He knew he should agree, step back, restore the distance that would keep them both safe. All right, he said instead. We'll forget it. But neither of them did. For the rest of the evening, they avoided each other's eyes and spoke only in short, practical sentences, pretending nothing had happened. And yet, something new now existed between them, invisible, but unmistakably real. A boundary they had both crossed, and one that could never truly be drawn again. That night, lying awake, Rael didn't think about his uncle. He didn't think about the conspiracy. He didn't think about the throne he still had to reclaim. Instead, he thought about how, for the first time in his life, the cold of his dragon blood had retreated before the warmth of another person's touch. Chapter 4. The morning began with shouting. Mira rushed out of the house with barely enough time to throw a shawl over her shoulders and saw her neighbor Agatha running down the road, waving her arms. They're coming, she shouted. From the main road, I saw the dust. Mira felt everything inside her tighten into a hard knot. Bandits. Once every 2 months, almost like clockwork. Their visits had become as inevitable as the changing seasons. How many? She asked, catching Agatha by the sleeve. I couldn't see clearly. 5, maybe 6? Mira nodded and hurried back inside. Rael had already heard the commotion and was trying to push himself up from the cot. What happened? He asked, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. Bandits, Mira said shortly, opening a chest and pulling out a small pouch of coins. All the money she had managed to save over the past 2 months. They come to collect tribute. It's not the first time. Tribute? Rael frowned. Since when do bandits collect tribute from villages in broad daylight? Since the king stopped answering our petitions, Mira said bitterly, as she tightened the strings around the pouch. We wrote 3 times. 3 times no one came. So now we simply pay them so they won't burn our homes. Rael went still. Something in his face darkened, not from pain, but from what she had said. The king knows about this? What difference does it make whether he knows or not? Mira gave a humorless laugh. We're too far from the capital for him to care. She didn't notice the way Rael's knuckles turned white as his hand curled into a fist. He said nothing, but there was a storm in his eyes. Stay here, Mira ordered as she headed for the door. Don't come outside until they're gone. The last thing we need is for them to notice a stranger staying in my house. Mira. She turned at the threshold. Rael was standing with one hand braced against the wall, his face tense, but his gaze steady. Be careful, he said. She gave a brief nod and stepped outside, unaware that he had no intention of obeying her. The bandits rode into the village like they owned it. 6 men on horseback, weapons displayed openly, wearing the smug expressions of men who knew no one would dare challenge them. At their head rode their leader, a heavy-set man with a scar running across his entire cheek, known as Boar. He had earned the name as much for his brutality as for his complete lack of mercy. The villagers stood outside their homes, silently handing over small pouches of coins and keeping their eyes lowered. No one dared complain aloud. A year earlier, Agatha's neighbor had protested. His house had burned to the ground before sunset. Mira stood by her gate, jaw clenched, and held out her pouch when Boar rode up to her. "The herbalist," he said with a smirk, taking the coins without even bothering to count them. "Always pays on time. Good girl." "Be grateful I pay it all," Mira said through her teeth. "One day the king will hear about you." Boar threw back his head and laughed. "The king," he repeated mockingly. "He doesn't even know the name of this miserable hole, let alone care what happens here." He turned his horse to continue down the road, then stopped. Rael was standing in the doorway of Mira's cottage, pale, one hand resting against the frame for support, but standing straight, and there was something in his gaze that made even a hardened bandit uneasy. "Who's that?" Boar asked, narrowing his eyes. "No one," Mira said quickly, her stomach dropping. "A relative. Move along." But Rael was already coming down the steps, slowly but steadily, despite the pain in his leg. "How much do you take from them every time?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was an icy edge beneath it that seemed to lower the temperature around them. Boar turned his horse fully toward the stranger, studying him with the interest of a predator scenting prey. "What's it to you, outsider?" "It matters to me that you're robbing defenseless people," Rael said, "and calling it tribute, as though you have some right to take it." Mira grabbed his sleeve and tried to pull him back. "Rael, don't," she whispered fiercely. "There are 6 of them, and you can barely stand." He didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Boar. "Step back, Mira." "Rael!" But he gently removed her hand from his sleeve and stepped forward, placing himself between her and the mounted men. Boar dismounted with a grin. The other 5 followed, spreading out with the lazy confidence of men certain they had every advantage. "Brave stranger," Boar drawled, pulling a heavy club from his belt. "Or stupid, usually the same thing." He attacked first, swinging the club in a wide, brutal arc. What happened next remained in Mira's memory only in fragments, as though she had watched it through clouded glass. Rael avoided the blow with an ease that should have been impossible for an injured man. Too smooth, too fast, not for someone who had nearly bled to death from 2 arrows only 2 weeks earlier. He caught Boar's arm as the man turned with the momentum of the swing. There was a crack, loud, distinct. Boar howled and dropped the club. 2 of the others rushed to help their leader. Rael met the first with a short, devastating strike to the chest that sent the man stumbling several steps backward before he crashed into the mud. The second needed only one movement. Rael swept his legs out from under him, and the bandit hit the ground on his back, his head striking the earth hard enough that he went completely still. The remaining 3 froze. Fear began to replace confidence on their faces. Rael turned toward them, and Mira saw something that made her heart stop. His eyes, normally pale gray, flashed almost white for a single instant. Cold, luminous, inhuman. His breath left his mouth in a cloud of frost, even though the spring day was warm. Then he blinked. The glow disappeared so quickly that Mira could almost have convinced herself she had imagined it. "Leave," Rael said. His voice was low, terrifying in its calmness. "And tell whoever sent you that this village will no longer pay tribute." Boar clutched his broken arm to his chest, his face turning almost green with shock. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he rasped. "We'll come back with—" "Come back," Rael interrupted. "I'll be waiting." There was something in his voice that was worse than a threat. Absolute certainty. cold and unshakable. It made the remaining bandits retreat toward their horses. A minute later, all 6 of them, including Boar, were racing away from the village as though demons were chasing them. Silence settled over the road. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then the villagers slowly began emerging from behind fences and doorways where they had hidden during the fight. Rael swayed. Mira reached him just before he collapsed. "Idiot," she whispered, wrapping an arm around his waist and helping keep him upright. "Complete idiot. You can barely walk, and you decide to fight 6 armed bandits?" "It worked," Rael muttered weakly, leaning more heavily against her than he wanted to admit. "You got lucky," Mira snapped, though her voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear she was only now allowing herself to feel. "You got unbelievably lucky." The villagers gathered around them, at first cautiously, then with growing confidence. They whispered among themselves, staring at Rael with a mixture of gratitude and superstitious awe. "He drove them away," Agatha whispered to someone nearby. 6 of them, with his bare hands. "Who is he?" another voice asked. Mira didn't answer, not because she hadn't heard, because she didn't know the answer herself. She led Rael back toward the house, her arm around his torso, and felt beneath her palm that his skin was cold as ice, despite the warm midday air. "Did you see anything?" Rael asked quietly, after she had settled him back onto the cot and begun checking whether his stitches had torn. Mira froze, her hands hovering over his shoulder. "What was I supposed to see?" she asked carefully. Rael studied her for a long moment, as though trying to decide how much truth she was ready to hear. "Nothing," he finally said. "Forget it." But Mira remembered. The flash of white light in his eyes, the frost of his breath on a warm day, the inhuman strength in a body that, only a couple of weeks ago, had been hovering on the edge of death. She didn't press him. Not yet. "You saved the village," she said instead, changing the bandage with careful movements. "Whatever you're hiding, today you saved people who had no one else to help them." Rael looked at her. Something in his expression softened, becoming almost vulnerable. "I couldn't stand by while they took the last coins from people who are already struggling to survive," he said quietly. "Especially from you." Mira stopped, her hands hovering over the bandage. Her heart skipped a beat at the way he said those final words. "From me?" she repeated. "From you," Rael said, never taking his eyes off her face. "You saved my life, Mira. I wasn't going to stand aside while someone threatened to take your home from you." She couldn't think of anything to say, so she simply finished dressing the wound in silence, feeling warmth spread through her chest despite the cold of his skin beneath her fingertips. That evening, when Mira stepped into the yard to fetch water, she found a small bouquet waiting by the doorstep. Wildflowers, clumsily gathered. Some of the stems were bent and already beginning to wilt, as though they had been held too long in an awkward hand. She turned toward the house. Rael was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize. A mixture of uncertainty and hope. Strangely out of place on a man who had taken down 6 bandits with his bare hands only hours earlier. "Did you pick these?" she asked, lifting the bouquet from the ground. "I tried," Rael said. For the first time since she had known him, genuine shyness entered his voice. "I'm not sure I did it properly. I've never given anyone flowers before." Mira looked down at the uneven, slightly crushed bouquet in her hands and felt something inside her begin to melt, despite every effort she had made to keep her distance. "What are they for?" she asked softly. "For saving me," Rael said, taking a step closer. "For putting up with me in your home. For not asking questions I'm not ready to answer yet. Mira looked up at him. In the fading light, his pale eyes looked almost silver. Not ready yet, she repeated. Does that mean you will be someday? Someday, Rael said. I promise. She didn't know what to say. So she simply pressed the awkward little bouquet to her chest and nodded, feeling the invisible thread between them draw tighter, growing stronger with every passing day. Chapter 5. Word of what had happened spread through the surrounding villages faster than wildfire. Within 3 days, people from neighboring settlements began appearing at Mira's cottage, at first timidly, pretending they had questions about herbs, when in truth, they simply wanted a glimpse of the man who had driven off Boar's entire gang by himself. Mira chased the curious away with sharp words, but privately she worried. The more people who learned about Rael, the greater the chance that word would reach someone who was never supposed to know he was here. You need to be more careful, she said that evening, after yet another visitor had finally left. People are talking about you. Too much. Rael sat by the window with the herbal book Mira had given him to study. He looked up. What exactly are they saying? That a stranger took down 6 armed bandits with his bare hands. That your eyes are strange. That maybe you're not even human. She deliberately made the last part sound casual, watching closely for his reaction. Rael held her gaze without flinching. People like to exaggerate. Maybe. Mira stepped closer and folded her arms across her chest. Or maybe they're not entirely wrong. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy like the air before a storm. Rael set the book aside and looked up at her. For the first time, Mira saw undisguised exhaustion in his face. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind that came from carrying too many lies for too long. Mira, he began. He never got the chance to finish. The sudden pounding of hooves sounded outside, sharp and urgent. Mira hurried to the window and saw a rider in the uniform of an imperial courier stopping in front of the village elder's house across the road. Royal trackers, she whispered. They're here. Rael rose so quickly that the bench scraped beneath him. What do they want? I don't know. Mira moved closer to the window, watching as the courier spoke with the elder and handed him a rolled decree. Maybe they finally responded to our complaints about the bandits. But when she saw the color drain from Rael's face, she knew he was thinking of something else entirely. They learned the truth by evening. The village elder, visibly shaken and confused, went from house to house carrying the royal decree. They're looking for a fugitive, he said when he reached Mira's door. Young man, pale eyes, possibly injured, wanted as an enemy of the crown. Mira felt the blood drain from her face. Behind her, somewhere deeper inside the cottage, she heard Rael go completely still. An enemy of the crown? She repeated, forcing her voice to remain steady. What did he do? Doesn't say, the elder shrugged. An order is an order. If we see him, we're supposed to report it to the capital immediately. There's a substantial reward. Then he moved on toward the next house, leaving Mira standing in the doorway with her heart hammering. She closed the door, turned around. Rael stood in the middle of the room, his face frozen like a mask, but his clenched fists betrayed the storm inside him. It's you, Mira said. Not a question, a statement. Rael was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes. What did you do? Mira's voice trembled, but she forced herself to stay where she was and look him directly in the eyes. Tell me the truth. At least now. I did nothing. There was such bitterness in his voice that Mira found herself believing him before he had even explained. They're making you look like a criminal because I'm standing in the way of someone who has far more power than conscience. Who? Rael turned toward the window, looking out at the darkening village road. I can't tell you everything.
Not because I don't trust you, he added quickly when he noticed her tense, but because the less you know, the safer you are.
Safer? Mira stepped closer, anger battling fear inside her. Rael, there is a reward for your capture. You've been living in my house for almost 3 weeks. If anyone finds out I've been hiding you, I know. He turned back to her, and she saw something almost painful in his eyes. That's why I have to leave, as soon as possible, before I bring trouble down on you or the entire village. The words hung between them like a sentence being passed. You can't leave, Mira said, quieter than she had intended. You're still weak, and even if you were fully healed, where would you go? Straight into the hands of the people hunting you? Better me than you, Rael said simply. Those 4 words shattered the last of her composure. Don't! Her voice dropped to a whisper. Treacherous tears stung her eyes, and she blinked them away angrily. Don't sacrifice yourself and pretend that makes it noble. It doesn't. It makes you stupid, Rael. If you leave now, you'll die before you make it a mile, and the people searching for you will find out you were here anyway. Rael watched her. Something in his expression softened, as though her anger affected him more than any calm argument ever could. You're right, he admitted quietly. But I can't keep staying here and pretending nothing is happening. Then stop pretending, Mira said. Tell me the truth. Not all of it if you can't, but at least part of it. She held his gaze. Who are you really? A long silence followed, filled only by the crackling of embers in the hearth and the faint wind outside. I was betrayed, Rael finally said. His voice was low, dulled by old pain. The person I trusted more than anyone in the world killed the people I loved. And now, he's hunting me because he wants to finish what he started. Mira said nothing. What you saw in the forest wasn't the work of bandits, he continued. It was an ambush. They were sent after me. By whom? I can't give you his name, not yet. Rael shook his head. But I swear to you, Mira, I am not a criminal. I'm the victim of a conspiracy. My only crime is surviving when someone wanted me dead. Mira studied his face, searching for a lie. She found none. There was too much pain in his eyes, too real to be an act. All right, she said at last. I won't push you for the rest, not until you're ready to tell me. Mira. But you're not leaving either, she cut in firmly, crossing her arms. Not in your condition, not with royal trackers searching the entire region. If you really want to protect me, the best way to do that is by staying alive and making sure no one sees you. Rael looked at her for a long moment, studying her as though he were seeing something he had somehow missed before. You're an extraordinary woman, he said quietly. Do you know that? Heat rushed to Mira's cheeks. She turned away quickly, hiding her embarrassment behind her usual practical severity. I'm a practical woman, she corrected him. Now, help me figure out somewhere better to hide you if those trackers decide to search the village. But that night, lying awake in the darkness, she kept returning to the way he had said those words, an extraordinary woman, and to the warmth that had spread through her chest from nothing more than the way he had looked at her. Chapter 6. A week passed before Rael dared make his first trip outside the village. His shoulder had healed enough for him to move without pain, though Mira still frowned whenever she examined the scar. Too smooth, too completely closed for a wound that recent. She no longer asked questions aloud, but Rael could see them lingering in her eyes every time her fingers brushed his skin. I need to go into town, he said one morning, pulling on an old cloak Mira had bought at the market. The wool was coarse, nothing like the fine fabrics he had worn all his life. To the inn. People say news from all over the region passes through there. Alone? Mira looked up from the pot of herbal brew simmering over the fire. With royal trackers searching everywhere? That's exactly why I should go alone. Rael pulled the hood low over his face. One traveler attracts less attention than two. Mira set down the spoon and stepped closer, her expression serious and worried. What are you looking for? Rael hesitated, but there was something in her face, open, honest concern, that made him tell her more than he had intended. People who may still be loyal to those who are gone, he said carefully. Witnesses, proof of what really happened. Proof of the betrayal, Mira said quietly, remembering what he had told her about the person he once trusted. Yes. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed and took her own herb basket from the hook beside the door. Then I'm coming with you. Mira. I have a legitimate reason to go into town, she interrupted, slinging the basket over her shoulder. I sell herbs. I buy salt. No one will think twice about seeing me at an inn. But a lone traveler in an unfamiliar cloak asking questions about affairs in the capital? That will draw far more attention than an herbalist traveling with a companion. Rael wanted to argue. He couldn't. Her logic was flawless. And if he was being truthful with himself, the thought of going into town without her left an unpleasant coldness in his chest, one that had nothing to do with his dragon nature. All right, he said at last. But if anything becomes dangerous, you leave immediately. Don't look back. We'll deal with that if it happens, Mira replied evasively. From her tone, Rael knew she had no intention of making that promise. The inn was alive with conversation, heart smoke, and the smell of ale. Mira settled near the counter and began bargaining with the innkeeper over a pouch of dried St. John's wort, while Rael pulled his hood low and took a seat in a distant corner where he could listen without attracting attention. At first, the conversations were mostly about grain prices, weddings, and funerals. But as evening approached and the ale loosened tongues, the talk gradually shifted toward the capital. Heard the regent postpone the mourning ceremonies for the late king again? One man said, lowering his voice. Third time now. Not surprising, another replied. They say they're still searching for the missing prince. The regent can't crown himself until he proves the heir is dead. Rael went still. His fingers tightened around his mug of ale until his knuckles turned white. And if they find him? A third voice asked. Then I suppose he'll keep searching until he finds him properly, the first man said with a grim laugh. That prince won't be any use to him alive, that's for certain. The conversation moved on, but Rael remained motionless, absorbing every word. So his uncle still hadn't dared crown himself openly, which meant there were still people demanding proof that the rightful heir was dead, which meant there was still hope. Across the room, he caught Mira's eye. She was watching him from the opposite side of the hall, her face tense, as though she too had heard enough of the conversation to understand. With the slightest nod, she indicated the door. They met outside in the shadow of the stable, far from curious ears. You heard them, Rael said. It wasn't a question. I did. Mira studied him closely. The prince, the missing heir. She paused. That's you, isn't it? Rael remained silent for a long moment, weighing how much more truth he could trust her with. Finally, he gave a single, short nod. Yes. Mira pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening. You... She shook her head, as though trying to make sense of it. You're the crown prince, and the man you're afraid of, the regent? My uncle, Rael said bitterly. He killed my father, and arranged the attack on me so he could take the throne. I escaped, but the poison on the arrows stopped me from defending myself the way I normally could. He stopped. He had said more than he intended, almost enough to reveal what he truly was. But Mira seemed too overwhelmed by the greater revelation to notice the slip. Gods, she whispered. Rael, if they catch you... I know. He looked at her, and something in his expression softened at the genuine fear on her face. "That's why I'm searching for proof. Witnesses who can confirm the truth about my father's death. Without them, I can't return and claim my birthright. They'll kill me before anyone has a chance to hear my story." Mira stared at him for a long moment. Rael watched fear, shock, and then something else move through her eyes. Resolve, firm and unwavering. "Then I'll help you find them," she said. "Mira, this could be dangerous." "You already risked your life to save my village," she interrupted. "Let me at least try to help you reclaim what is rightfully yours." Rael looked at her, an herbalist from a remote village. A simple woman with calloused hands offering to help the crown prince fight for his throne. Gratitude tightened in his chest so fiercely it almost hurt. They were already walking home by the time dusk settled over the forest. Only thin rays of dying sunlight broke through the branches above, and their conversation had long since faded as both of them became lost in thought. "Are you afraid?" Rael asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Mira glanced at him, surprised. "For you? Yes," she admitted. "You're walking along the edge of a cliff every day you stay here." "That isn't what I meant." She slowed. Her expression became thoughtful. "For myself?" She shook her head. "Not particularly. What do I really have to lose? A small cottage, a modest life? It isn't very much when you think about it." "You have more than you realize," Rael said softly. He stopped. Mira stopped as well, turning toward him in the dim forest light. "What do you mean?" Rael stepped closer. The air between them suddenly felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm. "You're kind," he said quietly. "You're strong. You weren't afraid to stand up to 6 bandits to protect your neighbors. You weren't afraid to shelter a fugitive wanted by the crown." His voice softened. "You're worth more than an entire kingdom, Mira. And I'm not sure you understand that." She stared at him. Her breathing quickened. Color rose into her cheeks, having nothing to do with the chill of evening. "Rael." "I was afraid," he interrupted, his voice lower now, more honest. "Not of losing the throne, not of failing to avenge what my uncle did." He held her gaze. "I was afraid you'd learn the truth and turn away from me, that I'd become nothing more than another stranger who brought danger into your home." "You were wrong," Mira whispered, taking a step toward him. "You're not danger, Rael. You're—" She never finished. Rael closed the last distance between them. This time, there was no uncertainty about who moved first. The kiss was nothing like their first. Not accidental, not hesitant, deliberate, slow. His hands settled around her waist and pulled her closer. Her fingers slid into his hair, and the entire forest seemed to fall silent around them, leaving only the two of them standing together in the gathering dark. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Their foreheads rested against each other, and Rael could feel her heart racing almost in rhythm with his own. "I don't know what happens next," he whispered. "I don't know whether I'll reclaim the throne. I don't know whether I'll defeat my uncle." He looked into her eyes. "But I know one thing, Mira. Whatever happens, I want you beside me." Mira looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I want that too," she whispered. "Whatever you are, a prince or an ordinary traveler, my heart stopped asking permission a long time ago." They remained there for a long while, holding each other in the middle of the darkening forest. For one brief moment, they forgot the conspiracy, the royal trackers, the throne, the danger. There were only 2 hearts that had finally found each other. Chapter 7. Luck finally turned in their favor 3 days later. Rael returned from another trip into town, pale, but with his eyes burning with that particular intensity Mira had already learned to recognize. He had found something. A witness, he said the moment he crossed the threshold, pulling off his cloak with hands trembling from excitement. A former palace stableman who served my father. He saw my uncle's men entering the king's chambers on the night of the murder, not through the main entrance, but through a secret passage used only by the regent's personal guard. Mira stopped what she was doing and set her mortar of herbs aside. Is he willing to testify? He is, if I can get him to the capital alive. Rael sank onto the bench and rubbed his face with both hands. But it isn't enough. One man's word won't stand against a regent who controls the government and the army. We need letters, orders, something stronger than an eyewitness account. And where would evidence like that be kept? There's one man, my father's former secretary. He handled all of the king's correspondence, including the secret letters. If anyone kept copies of the regent's messages, it would be him. The stableman said the secretary fled the capital after the coup and settled somewhere in this region because he feared retaliation. Mira narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. What's his name? Elias. Rael looked at her. Does that sound familiar? Mira nodded slowly. There's an herbalist named Elias living in the next village. He appeared about 6 months ago, keeps to himself, never talks about his past. I've met him twice at the market. Hope flashed through Rael's eyes, sharp and bright. We need to speak with him, immediately. They set out the following morning, but they never reached the neighboring village. Halfway there, a rider came galloping toward them at full speed, his face twisted with terror. Trackers, he shouted as soon as he saw them. Royal trackers are in your village. They're searching the houses. Someone reported seeing a stranger with unusual eyes. The blood drained from Mira's face. My house, she whispered. They'll find your things, evidence that you've been living there. Rael grabbed her hand, his expression turning hard and focused. We have to go back, now. They ran the entire way. Their lungs burned with exertion, but stopping was unthinkable. When the village finally appeared ahead, Mira saw smoke rising above the rooftops. Not the thin smoke of cooking fires. Thicker, darker, ominous. My house, she gasped, running faster. The cottage was still standing, but armed men crowded around the gate. Not local trackers, imperial soldiers, regent's men, judging by the crest on their cloaks. And among them, Mira recognized a face she had seen only once before, in an old portrait hanging in the village church. A face disturbingly similar to Rael's, only older, harder, with cold, merciless eyes. My uncle. Rael whispered beside her, his voice trembling with rage and shock. The soldiers had already noticed them. One pointed in their direction and shouted. The entire group began moving toward them. Run, Rael hissed, pushing Mira toward the forest. Run, I'll hold them off. I'm not leaving you. Mira, please. Too late. Soldiers closed in from both sides, cutting off every path of escape. Rael's uncle rode forward on a black horse, looking down at his nephew with cold, almost bored contempt. Persistent boy, he said, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. I thought the poison on those arrows would finish you much sooner. You killed my father, Rael said through clenched teeth, moving in front of Mira. Your own brother. Your father was too soft for the throne, his uncle replied indifferently. An empire needs a firm hand, not sentimental gestures of mercy toward every insignificant village. His gaze shifted to Mira. Something predatory entered his eyes. And this, I assume, is why you've been hiding in this miserable hole for so long. A common herbalist proved interesting enough to make you forget your duty? At the regent's signal, one of the soldiers stepped forward and roughly seized Mira by the arm, dragging her away from Rael. Let her go! Rael shouted, lunging toward her. 2 other soldiers caught him and twisted his arms behind his back. "You see, nephew," his uncle said with a cold smile. "This is what happens when you allow your heart to rule your mind. Weakness. It destroyed your father, and now it will destroy you." The soldier holding Mira pressed a knife to her throat. She froze as the cold steel touched her skin. "Release him," the regent growled, looking at Rael. "Or the girl dies first, and you'll watch it happen." Mira met Rael's eyes across the space between them, and for the first time, she saw something there she had never seen before. Absolute, all-consuming desperation. And beneath it, rage on the verge of exploding. "Rael," she whispered, though the blade against her throat made every word dangerous. Don't sacrifice yourself for—" She never finished. Angered by her resistance, the soldier jerked her arm sharply. The knife slid across her skin, leaving a thin line of blood along her neck. Mira cried out, and something inside Rael broke. The air around him suddenly froze. The temperature dropped so violently that the breath of the soldiers restraining him turned to clouds of white frost. Ice spread beneath Rael's feet, branching across the dry earth in thin, glittering veins. "Let her go." His voice was no longer human. It was deeper now, resonant and unnatural, as though 2 creatures were speaking through the same throat. The regent recognized the signs of the coming transformation. His face went pale. He stepped back. "Hold him!" he shouted at the soldiers. "Don't let him—" Too late. Rael threw the men restraining him aside with a single movement. Not a human movement. Too powerful. Too fast. And then his body began to change. Mira stared, forgetting even the knife that had been pressed against her throat. Rael's skin disappeared beneath icy scales that shimmered blue-white in the midday sun. His arms lengthened. His fingers transformed into claws as sharp as polished steel. Enormous wings unfolded from his back, covered in frost, as though they had been forged from ice itself. Within seconds, the man she had spent 3 weeks nursing back to health was gone. In his place stood a dragon. Huge, majestic, terrifying in its power. Its eyes burned with the same icy, otherworldly light she had glimpsed before. The soldiers screamed and scattered. The man holding Mira loosened his grip in shock. She tore herself free and stumbled away, pressing one hand against the cut on her neck. The dragon, Rael, roared. The sound rolled across the village and echoed from the walls of the houses. Then he attacked. He moved impossibly fast for a creature of his size. His wings tore through the air, and freezing breath poured from his jaws, turning everything in its path to ice. The soldiers who tried to resist fell one after another, not dead, but paralyzed by terror and cold, their weapons coated in thick frost until they became useless. The regent watched in growing horror. Then he turned his horse and tried to flee. Rael was faster. One sweep of a clawed foreleg sent the horse crashing down, throwing the regent into the mud. "Mercy!" the regent rasped as he crawled backward, experiencing for the first time the fear he had spent his life inflicting on others. "Rael, nephew, we can make an arrangement." The dragon loomed over him. Its eyes burned with cold, merciless fury. For a moment, it seemed certain that Rael's claws would come down and end the regent's life. Then he stopped. Mira held her breath. The dragon's icy eyes flicked toward her for a moment, as though searching for something. Her presence, her reaction, her fear, or the absence of it. She did not step back. She did not turn away in horror. She stood with one hand pressed against her bleeding neck and looked at him. At a creature from legend who was somehow the same man she had nursed in her cottage, the same man she had kissed in the twilight forest. There was no fear in her eyes, only shock, and something almost like awe. Whatever Rael saw there was enough to keep him from surrendering completely to his hunger for revenge. Instead of killing the regent, he caught him by the clothing with one enormous claw and lifted him from the ground. Then he roared so powerfully that the earth itself seemed to tremble. "You will stand trial," he said in that same inhuman voice, "before the entire empire you tried to steal with lies and blood." His grip tightened. "Death would be too easy for you." The remaining soldiers saw their leader helpless in the dragon's grasp. One by one, they dropped their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Only when Rael was certain the danger had passed did he begin to change back. The scales receded, the wings folded inward and vanished. His enormous body contracted until, where the ice dragon had stood, there was once again a man, bare-chested, breathing heavily, but alive and unharmed. Rael staggered, weakened by the sudden transformation. Mira rushed forward and caught him before he could collapse to his knees. "Rael," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. She no longer cared about the blood on her neck, or the soldiers surrounding them, or the regent still lying defeated in the mud. "Are you all right? Rael, look at me." He lifted his head. His eyes were human again, pale gray, exhausted, but alive. A weak smile touched his lips. "I thought you'd be afraid," he whispered, "now that you've seen the truth." Mira shook her head and pressed her palm against his cheek. "I was only afraid for you," she said firmly. "Dragon, prince, or whatever else he may be, you're still the man I don't want to lose." Rael closed his eyes and leaned into her touch as though drawing strength from it. "Mira," he whispered, "I love you. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid the truth about what I am would drive you away." She smiled through the tears that suddenly filled her eyes. "You couldn't drive me away even if you tried," she whispered. "I love you too, Rael, whatever form you take." Around them, the villagers slowly emerged from their hiding places. They stared at the captured regent, at the injured and demoralized soldiers, at the couple holding each other in the middle of the devastated village street. None of them fully understood what had just happened, but they all sensed that the world had changed forever. Chapter 8. The capital greeted them with the ringing of bells. Not the joyful peal of celebration, but the urgent tolling of alarm bells echoing over the city from the moment the procession appeared at the main gates. Rael rode at the front, still pale from the transformation and the journey, but holding himself straight with the dignity expected of the heir to the throne. Behind him, under heavy guard, rode the former regent, now simply Victor, stripped of his title even before the trial, by the sheer weight of public contempt. Farther back, in a closed carriage, traveled the stableman and Elias, the king's former secretary. Elias had been found that same day in the neighboring village, and had agreed to testify without hesitation the moment he learned that the rightful heir was alive. Mira rode beside Rael, and with every mile she felt more out of place in this world of stone towers and gilded crests, the world from which the man who had become dearer to her than anyone else had come. "You're quiet," Rael observed, leaning slightly toward her as their horses moved at an easy pace along the cobblestone road. "I'm looking," Mira admitted, "trying to understand how you ever survived in a place where all of this," she gestured toward the palace spires rising in the distance, "is considered ordinary." Rael gave a humorless laugh. "Sometimes I wonder that myself." He studied her more closely, a shadow of concern crossing his face. "Mira, whatever happens next, the trial, the coronation, all of it, you don't have to stay if you don't want to. I'll understand." Mira turned toward him, something between hurt and determination flashing in her eyes. Do you really think I raced all the way to the capital, helped save your stableman from the trackers, and spent 2 days being shaken half to death in a saddle just to turn around and go home now? I just want you to have a choice, Rael said quietly. I do have a choice. She reached for his hand. And I already made it. The day I decided not to leave you dying in that forest. Rael squeezed her fingers, and something in his expression eased, as though her words had lifted a weight he had carried throughout the entire journey. The trial took place 3 days later in the palace's great hall, before an assembly of nobles, military commanders, and representatives from every major city in the empire, hastily summoned by Rael's personal order. Victor stood before them in chains, stripped of every symbol of authority, yet still trying to preserve what remained of his dignity, chin raised, eyes narrowed with contempt, as though some part of him still believed he could find a way out. The stableman testified first. He was a simple man, visibly trembling before such a powerful gathering, but his testimony never wavered. He told them how, on the night of the king's murder, he had seen the regent's men enter the royal chambers through a secret passage rather than the main entrance. He told them how he had heard screams that ended far too abruptly for the king's death to have been natural. Then it was Elias's turn. The former secretary, still pale after months spent living in fear, placed a bundle of letters before the assembly, copies he had secretly made of the original correspondence before fleeing the capital. The letters contained Victor's plan, not only the murder of the king, but the assassination attempt on Rael as well, carefully disguised as an attack by bandits. The hall erupted in outraged shouts as the letters were read aloud. Realizing there was no longer any point in denying the truth, Victor finally dropped his mask of superiority. What replaced it was naked fury. I did what was necessary for the Empire, he shouted, struggling against the guards holding him. Your father was too weak, too indulgent toward those miserable backwater villages, wasting the treasury to protect people who should have been grateful to the crown simply for being allowed to exist beneath its rule. My father, Rael said as he rose from his seat, his voice carrying through the entire hall, cared about every person in this empire, from the greatest noble in the capital to the poorest farmer on the frontier. You call that weakness. I call it what true leadership is supposed to be. He turned toward the assembled nobles and city representatives. His voice grew stronger with every word. I have seen with my own eyes what happens to those the empire forgets. I saw a village robbed by bandits for months while its petitions to the crown went unanswered. I saw people forced to pay tribute because there was no one they could turn to for protection. The hall fell silent. This was not an isolated failure, Rael continued. It was the consequence of rule by a man who believed power existed for his own benefit, rather than for the people it was meant to serve. Everyone listened. When I take the throne, that will change. Every city, every village, even the most distant settlement will receive the protection it deserves, and that will not be an empty promise. The assembly erupted in approval. Even the most skeptical nobles bowed their heads in acknowledgement of the rightful heir. Victor was taken away under guard and sentenced to life imprisonment. Rael refused to have him executed, despite the urging of his advisors. He said only that enough blood had already been spilled because of one man's hunger for power. The coronation took place 2 weeks later, once every formality had been settled and news of the rightful heir's return had spread throughout the empire, bringing waves of celebration from the capital to the most distant borders. Mira stood among the courtiers, feeling terribly out of place in a borrowed gown far too delicate and elegant for hands accustomed to herbs, mortars, and hard work. She watched as Rael was crowned with his father's crown, heavy and set with blue sapphires the color of ice. something tightened in her chest, pride, and beneath it, a fear she couldn't quite explain. He was a king now, and she was only an herbalist from a remote village. With every word of the ceremony, the distance between them seemed to grow wider. After the coronation, as the crowd began to disperse and the courtiers made their way toward the banquet hall, Rael, now officially King Rael of the Ice Dragons, found Mira among the departing guests and walked directly toward her, ignoring every rule of protocol that demanded he remain among the nobility. "You're avoiding me," he said quietly when he reached her. "I'm giving you space," Mira corrected him, though deep down she knew he was right. "You're a king now, Rael. You have more important things to worry about than an herbalist from some forgotten village." "There is nothing more important than you." He took both her hands in his. "Mira, look at me." She raised her eyes. In his gaze, she saw the same vulnerability she had seen in the forest on the night of their first real kiss. "I don't want this crown if you aren't beside me," he said. "I didn't say those things just to comfort myself during those dark days in your cottage. I meant them then, and I mean them now." Then he lowered himself onto one knee, right there in the palace corridor, in full view of the astonished courtiers who had not yet left. "Mira," he said, taking a simple ring from his pocket. It wasn't gold or covered in precious stones. It was woven from delicate strands of silver, with a small sapphire the same color as his dragon eyes during his transformation. "I know I'm asking a great deal of you. To leave your home, the life you know, and become a queen in a world that is completely unfamiliar to you. But I promise that every day, I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret that choice." He looked into her eyes. "Will you marry me?" Mira stared at him as tears filled her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming happiness. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "The courtiers, your advisors, they won't approve of a king marrying a simple herbalist." "I don't care whether they approve," Rael said firmly. "You literally saved my life. You saw me as I truly am, the dragon, the man, all of me, and you didn't turn away." His hands tightened gently around hers. "You are the only person I want beside me on that throne." Mira sank to her knees in front of him, no longer caring about protocol or the shocked courtiers watching them. She cupped his face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Rael." His hands trembled with emotion as he slipped the ring onto her finger. And when their lips met, the palace corridor erupted in applause from the courtiers who had witnessed the moment. The wedding took place a month later. At Mira's insistence, it was more modest than royal protocol demanded, though still grand enough to satisfy the expectations of the nobility. Representatives from every major city in the empire attended the ceremony, including the elder of Mira's village, personally invited by the new king, in gratitude for the shelter the village had given him during his darkest days. Years later, whenever Mira remembered that day, she always smiled at how absurdly out of place she had felt in a wedding gown adorned with the ancestral jewels of the Ice Dragon dynasty. A simple herbalist who had become a queen not by right of birth, but by right of a love that had survived betrayal, pursuit, and the truth about the real nature of the man she loved. 1 year after the coronation, on the anniversary of the day Mira's village had been freed from Boer's bandits, King Rael signed a decree that would go down in the empire's history as one of the most important acts of his reign. The decree established the Royal Patrol Corps, units of soldiers stationed not only in the capital, but in every major city and every significant village throughout the empire, from the wealthiest trade routes to the most remote frontier settlements. For the first time in decades, the protection of the crown would extend equally to all its subjects, not only to those who lived in the shadow of the palace walls. You remember, Mira said that evening as she watched Rael seal the decree with the royal seal. When you told me in the forest that I was worth more than an entire kingdom? Rael looked up at her, a warm smile touching his lips. I remember every word. Then let this decree be proof, she said, stepping closer and resting a hand on his shoulder, that every person in this empire, from the humblest herbalist to the highest noble, is equally worthy of the crown's protection. Rael covered her hand with his and brought it to his lips. That's exactly why I signed it in the first place, he said softly. You taught me that, Mira. Not the scholars in the palace, not my advisors, not the chronicles of my ancestors. He looked into her eyes. You, a simple herbalist who saved a wounded dragon in the forest without ever knowing who you were really saving. Mira smiled and leaned into him. Beyond the palace windows, the setting sun painted the sky in the same orange and gold that had filled the forest where everything had begun, with the scent of blood that did not belong to any ordinary human, and one young herbalist's decision not to walk away. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. I hope this story touched your heart. But what would you have done if you were in Mira's place? Would you have been able to trust a man who was hiding his past while carrying the fate of an entire kingdom on his shoulders? Or would you have decided that love wasn't worth the danger that came with it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to know what you think. See you again soon. With love, Karina and Mia.